I have a strong dislike for floating terrain, and today I'm going to show a system of roads that are built into the ground like roads. I'm also going to show a new scatter terrain placement technique that means your scatter terrain will have no need for floating bases either. Welcome to the archive. To get started, I went through many stages of planning, and in the end I settled on a variety of tiles that I'll show throughout the video. Doing it this way I felt was the best compromise between modularity and a realistic looking finish. A little later in the video I'll be showing a ton of different ways you can assemble the tiles, but for now I'm just going to start crafting. To get started, I cut a range of tile sizes all listed in the pinned comment and magnetised them. Magnetise! The way that I've shown in the cottage or cave video. I didn't bother adding card to the bottom of all these tiles as I've now fully magnetised this system rather than using card tabs. Huzzah! You can use card tabs like I've shown in earlier videos, but I use this system more than most, so for me the magnets are worth it. Some of you might say, "That's not right, I've watched and you put it on some tiles." Yes I did, but only because I can't get 1/2 inch thick foam very easily, and 2 layers of chipboard make 10mm foam match up with 1/2 inch foam pretty nicely. Also helps stop warping. Once magnetised, I got on with the more fun bits. I show a lot of pieces in this video, but if you really want to save time and make the minimum possible, you can do most things, including diagonal roads, with just 3-inch straight pieces and 6-inch turn pieces. I also made some of these larger curves with a turn off that can just look like a pullover patch for a wagon, but can also really change the shapes that you can make with this piece. The size of the piece means that it doesn't give you the same flexibility as some of the smaller curves can though, especially when weaving a road through other terrain. I made 2 types of straight piece, 2 sizes of curve, as well as a few road forks. By making a few pieces longer, it really helps me reduce the obvious modular pattern that would otherwise appear on longer sections of straight road. I started by casting up some plaster boulders for later using a Woodland Scenics mould. The link for this is available in my equipment list linked in the comments, and anything you buy from the Amazon links there helps support the channel a little. Then I drew the roads onto the tiles, keeping the line at the edge of each one at a right angle to the edge so that they'd line up well no matter which way they were turned. There's also a template for this for patrons, so check out my Patreon in the description if you think that would help your build. Once drawn on, I used the back of a paintbrush to push in some grooves and stab in some hoof prints where they would have been worn down by weather, passing wagons and the animals pulling them. I made sure not to carry these grooves right the way to the edge of the piece so that everything would still line up well without any sharp edges. This is another reason I made some longer pieces. It lets you make some deeper grooves into the ground without them seeming unnaturally steep. For these pieces I actually cut chunks out of the road first with a knife to add even more depth before using the brush, though it ended up being a bit more trouble than it was worth. If I did it again, I think next time I would make it from 2 1/4 inch thick sheets and cut the dip into the top one and then just glue them together. I painted them in a base coat of dark brown and Mod Podge to toughen them up. Don't worry if the foam looks messy, it'll be covered anyway. Now I had the rough shape, I used the dirt and grout mix that I've shown in a few videos like the Grasslands one to cover the road sections, sealing it on with some PVA glue. Once that dried, I took a pinch of the smaller, sandier bits of Geek Gaming's Arid Earth mix, which is a nice natural mix of small stones and sand, and sprinkled it along the road edges. Sprinkling it very lightly over the centre too, before sprinkling on just a tiny amount more grout over those road edges to blend the stones into the dirt. To hold it all in place, I sprayed them with scenic sealant, which I've shown how to make and use in my War Camp scatter terrain video. This will also rather handily activate the grout and make it rock hard. Here's a quick clip of all the tile types I made. Like I say, there's a template available on Patreon for those awesome people who support the channel. Speaking of them, here's a nice gallery of shots while I thank my generous patrons, without whom these videos would not be made. That support is absolutely crucial, and as I've said before, without enough patrons in the long run, I quite simply couldn't afford to continue, so thank you so much to everyone who helps out. There's also a bunch of benefits to being a patron, partially because I'd like to say thank you, including some templates for a bunch of other builds, printables, bonus videos, live streams, and polls on what I make next. So if any of that sounds cool, please check it out. Once the roads were done, I added on some of the plaster boulders to the larger sides of the road on about half the tiles of each type. Painted them with a leopard spot technique that I've shown in the cavern video, and scattered some dirt and grout mix around them once the paint had fully dried so that it didn't stick to the rocks. and dusted away any excess on the rocks with a makeup brush. On the other half, at least for the straight tiles, I wanted to try something new. I really like run-down old stone walls next to roads like this, but I wanted to do a bit of an experiment to see what I could get a wall like this to look like if I built it rock by hand. I used a variety of small rocks and slate that I got for basing from Geek Gaming, but you could just use rocks from your garden. I wanted to see if this method worked and got a better result than foam, and if it took as long as people seemed to think it would. It turned out challenging but satisfying. Building it manually rather than just tossing the rocks in a mould with some glue means that the end result actually obeys gravity and looks like it was constructed carefully rather than glued into place. The shots I've managed here aren't great at showing that off, but you can really see it more in person. I started layering them up and occasionally covered them in Zap liquid superglue to seal them solid, using kitchen roll to soak up any excess glue so it didn't dry on thick. I used the bigger rocks where possible to make the shape, filling in the gaps and levelling out uneven sections using the smaller ones, but big and small are kind of relative terms here. I didn't use a single stone bigger than about half an inch. Finally, to add some more natural looking weathering back to the stones, I sprayed them with a matte varnish to remove the shine, and with a makeup brush dusted on some white grout mixed with a small amount of black and brown grout to make this light grey cream and make it look a bit weathered. I brushed off most of the surface layer quite heavily so it just tinted the colour of the rocks, and sealed it with a spray of matte varnish. Once made, I realised I'd made a horrible mistake and they weren't going to allow a wagon-sized vehicle to pass along the road, because they were too big. Whoops. To fix this, I ended up putting them on a separate tile that I could line up next to the road instead. Not a huge deal really. I drew around the wall and indented the foam with the back of a brush to sink the wall into the dirt. Also means I can slap them down in a field for some random scatter. I also took this opportunity to add some Woodland Scenics deadfall twigs, kindly donated by my ever-helpful girlfriend, to the other side of the tile, indenting the foam for them too to bury them in the dirt. Then I just Mod Podged and browned that to seal it and PVA glued the wall and twig in place just to be sure, before filling the dip around the walls with more grout and dirt over PVA glue, burying the lower stones a bit and making the ground flat-ish again. To seal this on, I dripped on some scenic sealant, which will help activate the grout and seal the whole lot solid. If you have some, isopropyl alcohol can be dripped on here and there to break the surface tension that you can see here. To complete the effect, I added some moss to the walls and ground using Woodland Scenics burnt grass flock mixed with watery PVA glue. I also added some weeds, but I'll come to that in a minute. I absolutely love the end result. I feel like it's really worth it for a D&D build where you don't need to fill an entire 6-foot board with them. The interesting thing here is it wasn't actually that much slower than making them from foam, especially if you could just jump between walls while the glue was drying. Between all the carving, indenting and painting that you do on foam walls, you actually spend quite a lot of time on them. It's still not the fastest technique, but if you can get the right rocks, it's definitely not as time consuming as people seem to think. For the static grass, I used the same mix that I used in my grassland tiles video so that it would blend together nicely. Starting with a layer of a mix of 4 and 6mm dead grass over Geek Gaming fast drying basing glue, the name of which is deceiving because it dries fast but remains sticky, which is kind of perfect for laying down static grass. A quick tip here, keep the grounding wire of the static grass applicator close to the same patch of glue where you're sprinkling, and keep the basket as close to the tile as possible. The more you do this, the more powerful the effect. Over the top of this, I sprinkled some grout and dirt mix. The scenic sealant will grab this and soak it down to the ground in the final stage. I sprayed that with some cheap car varnish from the pound shop, blocking the road with a sheet of paper, and then applied a second layer of 4 and 6mm autumn blend. All these grasses I bought from Geek Gaming because I really like their colour mixes. You can use other grasses, you just won't get the same effect. There was one thing that I did do that was new though. I used a mix of some 2 and 4mm dead grass in small patches along the edge of the road to blend the grass into it. This gave a nice impression that the grass was spreading and slowly overgrowing that section of path, but being beaten back and killed basically by walking travellers. I also added a few patches in the middle of some of the tiles to give that natural worn away look. Now before the realism police come for me, you don't want to leave a full strip of grass running down the middle of the road. does happen on modern roads because, weirdly enough, cars don't have horses pulling them and trampling down the grass. There you go, can't say I didn't mention it. Finally, I sealed the tiles by spraying them with scenic sealant 2 to 3 times to strengthen the grass and make it playable. To add some flexibility for smaller paths where it would make sense, like leading up to buildings, I made some extra footpath tiles, 1 inch wide, half weaving left to right, the other half weaving right to left. I made these with the exact same techniques, just smaller, and added some rocks and weeds and the accessory slots that I'm about to show in the next section. To add some more interesting features to the roadside and rocks, I added a few small weeds that I made, using jute twine leftovers from making my thatch rooftops in the stable video. Basically the same stuff that I used for the hay bales in that video. First I cut it up a bit and then tried making a more intense version of what I did for the ivy in the cottage video. In that video I soaked it in watered down burnt umber ink, but it seemed to lose its colour a little bit once dry and positioned. This time I went with the pure stuff and it seemed to hold the colour much better, as well as drying a lot faster. Once dry, I spread it out a bit again into the smaller shapes that I wanted and sprayed each one with Super 77 adhesive in a well-ventilated area with a mask and sprinkled on a variety of tree leaf foliage from Geek Gaming. To attach them to the ground, I just used a bit of PVA. They really don't need much. I'm not totally happy with how these turned out. Some of them are a bit bright and you can kind of see some of the adhesive on the branches. But the nice thing about them is even if I can't fix that with some brown ink through an airbrush, you can just rip them out and make them again without ruining the rest of the entire piece. Finally, I added something to combat the dreaded floating scatter terrain base. Having a base on scatter terrain is a pet peeve of mine and seemed like a necessary evil, but with this tile system I'm working on, it's starting to seem easier and easier to avoid. I started by punching a small hole where I want the accessory to connect using a needle, ideally one about as thick as a paperclip at a right angle, roughly. From there I sealed over the top with a smooth layer of hot glue before drilling through that layer from below with a pin vise, using a drill bit as thick as, well, yeah, a paperclip. You can even do a layer of super glue over the hot glue to harden it even further. Then all you need to do is attach a blob of blue tack to the bottom. You might need to widen the hole a bit at the bottom to accommodate it, but it should fit in nicely, with a bit of brush-based encouragement. Now you can make a range of accessories with paper clips drilled into the bottom, which clip onto these tiles with no need for a base. Awesome. And if the blue tack wears out of stick, it's very easy to replace. On the top side, you can cover them with whatever you want, but I usually leave a patch of flat texture, like dirt, around the hole, so any accessories can stand smooth with the floor. When there's no accessory in the slot, it just looks like a patch of dirt. I added these to the corners of a few grass and dirt tiles. Why the corners, you ask? Basically, it lets each tile change the accessories to 4 different locations just by rotating the tile. It also means you can line the tile up against a road or turning and have an accessory close enough to look like it's part of the road design. Incidentally, there was a grass tile with a small patch of dirt in that shot. Did you notice it? Exactly. Speaking of accessories though, I made 2 new ones, namely this updated version of the gibbet post, which is exactly what it looks like, a stick of stained balsa with a wire hook and some chain on it. If you want to know more about making the gibbet itself, check out my video on banners, gibbets and torches in the description. I also made this nice little road sign, which is another piece of balsa dowel with some balsa strips glued on. I started out staining this with some light oak wood stain. I started experimenting with different stains for different results. This one didn't work out so well, it came out a bit too orange, so I reverted to using Army Painter's soft tone wash. I also added some nails, which were basically just small bits of wire, made using the sharp end where I clipped it off to punch it in with some pliers. Finally, I added some moss to these signs. I might add some new signs with snow on the top for snowy areas in the future. I really like little details like that. I absolutely love this system because it makes the road and accessories actually feel like part of the landscape. Please subscribe, like, comment and share, and until next time, I'll be in the archive.